Welcome, folks, to our third installment of Civil Rights. This is our third of four video lessons about civil rights in the United States. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So, what we have left to cover in the next this video and the next one are Native American rights, women's suffrage, the women's rights movement, and feminism, LGBTQIA rights, and of course, immigration and civil rights for Hispanic Americans. Now, we will get to the first three in this video, and then video 4 will cover the last two. All right, so without further ado, here we go. Okay, so there are two original sins of the United States. The first is, and in order of what happened, the Native American genocide that European settlers committed when they came here. The second is slavery. Those are the two original sins, and honestly, the United States has answered for neither one as a whole, as a government, right? It has been massively underwhelming, to say the least, in terms of how we have tried to atone for those sins. Some would argue we haven't really managed to atone at all. It's lip service at best. Now, there were three, to give you a little bit, and again, if you, I encourage you to explore this topic in greater detail. I also have video lessons on American history that you can explore these topics in various detail, or you can go to more of an expert on these issues and take a class in this. But for our purposes, let's just bare bones. There are three primary government policies that were enacted during the history of the United States proper. So I'm talking about once we became an official country, we overthrew Great Britain, became the United States of America. These are the three primary policies. So first one was separation. We wanted to separate them completely from ourselves. So we just kept pushing them farther west, farther south, just away. The next stage was assimilation and citizenship. So that is when Native American children in particular, but all American Indians, were taken into government, U.S. government-run schools, forced to cut their hair, get rid of their native traditions, their garb, their religion, their language, and adopt that of white America, effectively. And in exchange, they got citizenship. And then the final stage is tribal restoration, which the government has made some progress in terms of that, but too little, too late. I mean, the vast majority of Native American cultures have been completely eradicated. So, that's cute that you want to come back and try to make up for the wrong that we did, but there's no way to make up for that. Matter of fact, the American Indian was the last group to get full citizenship and to get the right to vote, and that happened in 1924. So every single person in the country, every single citizen in the country got the right to vote before the original inhabitants of this land. They were the final group in 1924. So there have been some good things that have come from tribal restoration. Again, it's not enough, but it's something. There's a great deal of renewed cultural pride. But again, Native Americans are the least educated, most unemployed, and poorest of all ethnic groups in the United States. So if we're looking at the race to who's the most oppressed, these folks right here, bar none. And the data confirm that. So we certainly have a lot of work to do in righting the wrongs that have been done in the name of America in the past and present as well. So you're against illegal immigration. Splendid. When do you leave? This is why I love to look at all the white people who are like, keep them out. They're not real American. Really? Are you a real American? Like, come on. Like, splendid. Bye. Everybody who came here was an illegal immigrant. Immigration. Illegal aliens have always been a problem in the United States. Ask any Indian. Right? And then this, usually a white Republican male. It's time to reclaim America from illegal immigrants. And there's a depicted Indian. I'll help you pack, right? So these are some political cartoons and some memes that just sort of exemplify the fact that some of these people are running around proclaiming themselves to be the true Americans, and nothing could be further from the truth. There's nothing true about their viewpoint at all. It's certainly not even in keeping with the Constitution. So, all right, women struggle for equal rights. So 50% of the population, in many cases over 50, depending on where you're at, um, not in China, though. They actually don't have enough women over there because they had the one child policy for a while. And because patriarchy being what it is, women are less than men. Everybody wanted sons. So they made sure they had a son. They would give out their daughters for adoption. They would abort the pregnancies. They would kill, in some cases, infanticide, right? So in China, they don't have enough women, but that's a separate discussion, right? But in the United States, we're 50% of the population, and we don't have much to show for it now, do we? So now I have some. This is a picture depicting women protesting against the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1977. So they were against the Equal Rights Amendment for women, and they are women. So it's interesting to see different strokes for different folks here. And then I included this, what I thought was a funny meme. Women in the 1600s. I was just thinking, men, which, right? Like, strong, independent women who can, fend for themselves were considered outside the norm and therefore dangerous, right? So, and this is unfortunately an idea that has continued. Not quite, we're not necessarily burning people alive at the stake anymore, at least not literally. But sexism, unfortunately, just like racism, is alive and well. So the early women's political movements, I need you to understand, feminism in its modern context did not exist in the early women's rights movements. These women did not believe that women should do what men do. Okay, they wanted political rights, but many of these women did not believe that women were suited for what was typically a man's job, right? They didn't necessarily want to serve in Congress. They wanted to be at home, raising the family, taking care of their husbands, but they did believe they should have a larger role in how what political policies were enacted because they were the moral leaders, the moral directors of the family, as they were primarily in charge of child rearing and keeping of the home. Now, does that mean that everybody during the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and those early movements believed what I just said? No, there were plenty of people who believed in equality, but the prevailing view was not modern feminism. So it's important to note. Okay, then you have the movement for women's suffrage continues and advances. We finally get it with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Finally get the right to vote. Yay. Then we have another movement emerge because remember, even though we got to right to vote, that's great, but you can't open a bank account. You can't own property. You can't, if you're a single mom, it's considered that you're immoral and so you're unemployable and you're derelict. And so there was a lot of discrimination and lack of access to resources and opportunities that existed. Hence the 1960s modern feminist movement. And that began in the 1960s, continued throughout the 1970s, and even continues now to a certain extent. The modern iterations are the Me Too movement, fighting against sexual harassment and assault. Now, the National Organization for Women was established in 1966, and it is an interest group directed at advancing legal, political, economic, and social rights for women, very similar to the NAACP as an interest group and legal think tank for African American civil rights, now was established for women. So here's a breakdown by country in which women get the right to vote, right? So where are we? We're right over here, bro. Like Germany. Germany got it before we did. Like for real, like that's right at the end of World War One. Like Germany had it before we did. Like come on now. I mean, there are other countries that came afterwards, but we had several countries that had happened before it happened here, right? Yemen, 1984. Actually, I don't even know if the women still have the right right now because there's been a lot of political upheaval, but it was recognized at that point. So, okay, so here's the modern women's movement. Or, we're talking about that, but let me give you like a timeline of the stages of fighting for women's rights, right? So, feminism is here. Again, women's suffrage movement. Sorry, my cat is trying to press buttons on my keyboard. Got to stop that from happening. So, almost uniformly about the right to vote and basic civil protections, right? They believed in the fundamental differences between the genders and believed in this idea of a separate sphere ideology, like women control everything in this area, just like the dual Dual federalism, the separate spheres. States control this, federal controls that. It's a similar concept. Men control this, women control that, right? Then we have the advent of feminism. That's early 1900s up to the 1960s. And that advocated total equality, literal total equality. Right to vote was an essential step in this process. They do not believe in fundamental differences or separate spheres. Anything a man can do, a woman can do as well. They advocated for economic, political, and civil protections. Then we have the most modern women's liberation movement. That's the 1960s to the present. So that takes feminism a step further. The goal was to eradicate all sex discrimination and sexism. And this movement is where you get things like Title IX, right, which are protections and mandating federally funded and federally regulated equality in sports, for example, for women. So, and again, I just said this. Okay, so we have a couple here. So, first thing, well, this is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64. That prohibits gender discrimination in employment. And again, that's still somewhat difficult to enforce, right? Because in a male dominated area, if you're trying to prove discrimination, you need to have evidence of it, evidence that will hold up in a court of law. And sometimes that was really very difficult to come by. These folks who violated Title VII were very good at hiding it. The Supreme Court also held that Title VII includes prohibitions on sexual harassment. So it's not just gender discrimination, like as in I'm not going to hire you because you're a woman or because you have a child. You can't be sexually harassed. And if you can document sexual harassment, you have standing to sue and the federal government will step in. So some things to know about Title IX, okay? So you can pause the video and write all this down so that you're aware of what Title IX is all about. We're going to talk about this more in class as we move forward with our civil rights units. But pause the video and write all this stuff down. Okay, so wage discrimination. We still have this in place to a certain extent. It's improved massively. There are some changes. Now, you can find data and graphs and studies to back up virtually anything that you think, whether it's correct or not. You can find graphs that show that the wage discrimination or the differences in wages in men and women is largely due to women choosing to leave the workforce to stay home and raise kids, right? You can also find that it's women are punished for having families, right? So, whereas if men had access to paternity leave, a woman could go back to work soon after, a new addition to the family, and father could stay home and raise the children. But that's something that's still not very much accepted at this point. A stay-at-home dad is still seen as something less than. He's not a real man. There's this attitude amongst many. The younger generations, not so much. Millennials and Gen Zers have a very different perspective on this. So hopefully this cultural norm will continue to change to where parenting is parenting, and regardless of your particular situation, your desire to grow your family is respected and supported. So now we also have to deal with age discrimination, right? So in 1967, we passed laws that prohibited, sorry, couldn't think of the word, had a little brain fart there, that prohibited discrimination on the basis of age. Now, this one's really tough to fight because it's tough to prove that. It's really, really tough to establish that. So it's difficult. Once you have a job, it's usually easier to keep it, but unless there's an economic crisis and you get laid off, but trying to get the job after you've been laid off and you're an older American, that can be tough. So mandatory retirement has progressively been made illegal by laws that have been passed in 78 and 86. So we do have some protections for that as well. And then, of course, there's the ADA. You must know about this act, the American with Disabilities Act of 1990. This prohibits job discrimination against individuals with physical or mental disabilities. So this is also part of this law, required physical access to public buildings and public services. So all government buildings had to be renovated. This cost a lot of money, but it was necessary. Right? There were some limitations. For example, if you are a private corporation, or you're have an older residence, you're renting out, you're a landlord, right? And you haven't done major renovations on your property, you are grandfathered in. You are not required to say, put in an elevator or build ramps or fundamentally alter your structure. Once you do wide scale renovations, then you are by law, you must update to current building code, and current building code mandates that buildings be accessible to Americans with disabilities. So, you need to, and people need to be able to access if they're blind or if they're in a wheelchair, right? So, um, there are some exceptions, but there are some limitations. But for the most part, at least government buildings uniformly have to be accessible to disabled persons. Then we also have rights of and status of juveniles. Okay, so children are supposedly protected by their parents. Okay, that's the assumption. But unfortunately, we know that not all parents are good parents, and not all parents care about their children. Not all parents protect their children. Many, or I shouldn't say many, but some parents outright abuse and neglect their children, right? Child labor, for example, was widespread in the early 20th century, the 1900s, with the Industrial Revolution. In 1938, we finally passed laws banning child labor, finally, so that we could actually protect young children. A legal definition of minor does vary state to state. Some are articulated as 18 and under, but some states say as young as 13, 14, 16 can be charged as an adult, depending on the crime. Um, National voting rights have also changed. Originally, it was 21, but at 18 you could be drafted. So people are like, this is messed up. You can go fight for your country, but you can't vote about politicians going to war that you're going to have to fight in. So we have the 26th Amendment in 1971 that lowered the voting age to 18. And that is it for part 3. I hope you all learned what you needed to, and I will see you in part 4.